This afternoon, we're going to continue both with Keynote and with a couple more panels, kind of moving more toward the physical world, interventional medicine, and also starting to talk more about the people aspects of things. But before that, we are really thrilled to be able to have a Keynote talk. This is sponsored by Intuitive Surgical. Just by way of background, we've had a great relationship with Intuitive Surgical in our center up on the Homewood campus for many, many years. Earlier, I mentioned that we had a center in computer integrated surgery starting in the late 90s. And of course, Intuitive kind of popped on the scene early in those days. And I remember us looking at them and thinking, okay, is this a horse that's going to be something that's going to keep going, or is there going to be another company that kind of comes but doesn't make it over the barrier? But in fact, they have survived that entire chart that I showed you all the way out to being a very successful product company. Today, we're pleased to have Simon DiMaio here to speak to us. So Simon has been really over the past several years a great partner for us at Intuitive Surgical. He's been often a liaison into their research group. His background is in robotics. His PhD from UBC was in haptics, if I recall correctly. And then he moved to Intuitive Surgical relatively soon after that, after a postdoc. And I think has been there pretty much his entire career. So he also has seen the company grow with time. His current title is Senior Manager for Research and Advanced Product Development at Intuitive Surgical. So he also lives in that spectrum of trying to understand how do you translate technical advances and new ideas into products that can actually have an impact in the real world. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing the stories he has to tell. Simon.
Thank you, Greg. My stomach is now competing with my brain for blood, so hopefully this goes well. You're going to have the same problem. As Greg mentioned, thanks so much for the introduction. It's really an honor to be invited to speak here today. This has been an incredibly inspiring morning, and so I'm looking forward to feedback on what I'm going to be saying, and also hopefully to share some stories. This is a little bit of a switch, as Greg mentioned, to more of the interventional aspects, but I think there are pieces of this that hopefully will tie into this morning's themes as well. So, engineering background for myself personally, my connection with Hopkins goes back to the year 2000, and I'm not sure if Russ and Greg remember me as a grad student arriving in the year 2000 looking for a PhD project and looking for inspiration. And that trip actually got me sort of on the path towards a medical project that ultimately became a dissertation topic, and then a postdoc, and now almost 10 years in industry. And throughout that time, I've managed to maintain a connection with the team here, both as an academic collaborator when I worked in Boston at the Harvard Med School, and then in the last decade working at Intuitive in the industrial setting. So it's really been quite an interesting viewpoint for me. So today I'm going to talk a bit about the company. I'm going to spend a brief amount of time to introduce the company. Some of you, I know this is a pretty diverse group. I'll give a quick bit of background, but this talk isn't really about Da Vinci or Intuitive. It's more about this process of collaboration between primarily industry and academic engineering researchers, but it's going to pull in some of the clinical aspects as well. So that's the basic template for the presentation. So as I promised, very quick background. Company was started in 1995. Interestingly, it had technologies that had roots within academia. Some numbers, astonishing numbers in terms of the number of procedures performed to date. So 3.8 million procedures done with Da Vinci systems worldwide. If you look at the change in that number year by year, it's essentially exponential, and so last year we did 652,000 procedures, which comes to almost 2,000 procedures a day, which when we remind ourselves of that on the engineering side is just remarkable that there are 2,000 of these procedures and systems happening daily. 3,800 systems installed worldwide, 2/3 of those in the United States, a third internationally. This is the product. It's the Da Vinci system. For those who are not familiar, I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail. You can find information on our website. It's essentially a telerobotic, telepresence system for assisting minimally invasive surgery. The company really thinks of itself as less of a product platform, single product platform company, but more of an ecosystem a product company. And so if you think of the family of Da Vinci systems that are emerging as being a piece of that ecosystem, but you can also think of instrumentation, imaging instrumentation that manipulates tissue in various ways as being part of that ecosystem. You can think of the training technologies, simulation, training consoles, and things like that as being part of the ecosystem. Think of customer support and how that impacts how the system is used. Think of the portfolio of procedures that the system is being used for as being part of that ecosystem. Some of the newer aspects of bringing in analytics and data analytics for helping hospitals with their programs and to make them more efficient as an emerging area that we'll talk about briefly later. And then this huge body of peer-reviewed publications and comparative studies that have surrounded the Da Vinci platform, and the company is being part of this ecosystem. So for those of you who are not familiar, this medical device is being used for a broad spectrum of applications, from transoral procedures to pelvic procedures, and that introduces some real challenges in terms of where do you optimize. And so it's a single platform that addresses a family of many different procedures. So for those who are not that familiar with this, what is the basic premise of Da Vinci? And very quickly, open surgery can be hard on the patient, as you can see. Pain, morbidity, risk of post-operative complications, the scarring effects, and so on. Similarly, so minimally invasive surgery may benefit the patient, but can be hard on the surgeon. Here you're seeing a laparoscopic surgeon. Challenges of ergonomics, the challenges of fatigue, the challenges of the learning pathway of becoming an expert in this technique where you're not interacting with tissue directly. The challenges of being limited in some cases in terms of what types of procedures you can perform this way. So more complex procedures that involve suturing, fine dissection can be limited. So the premise here is that with telepresence and robotics, we can attempt to combine the best of both worlds by giving back the surgeon some of the benefits of their open surgery without the deficits that the patient experiences through better ergonomics, better visualization of depth, and then giving their wrists back and their ability to precisely interact with tissue. And then this other aspect of the fact that there is now software in the loop that we can leverage in interesting ways, and we'll hear more about that. You've heard about that this morning, and we'll hear more about that this afternoon, where there are opportunities to extend the capabilities of surgery even further. So this is probably a familiar technology diffusion curve that many of you may have seen before. It was popularized by Geoffrey Moore in his book called Crossing the Chasm. And it's this idea that technologies, as they diffuse into the marketplace, happen often in a particular sequence. And if you imagine the horizontal here being time, typically your technologies are adopted early on by the visionaries, the early adopters. And there's this thing called the chasm that most technologies face, which is how do you cross from that early group of users to the majority, which is really should be your target. And so in the case of Da Vinci, what's interesting is that you can't really think of the platform crossing this chasm. You can think of the platform being used for specific procedures. So think of the early days of Da Vinci focused on cardiac procedures, really got stuck in that chasm, whereas you think of urology as crossing that gap, but only in the US. Look at the rest of the world, urology is still stuck in that chasm. So it's interesting for us to think about, Da Vinci is a successful product, but we still have this challenge of taking procedures, specific clinical interventions, and crossing this chasm with technology. This is a whole topic for conversation. What I want to hone in on actually is the second chasm. If we think from the perspective of research and development, is how do we take these early concept ideas and get them to those initial early adopters. And I'm going to speak a little bit from the perspective of kind of a human-centered design perspective and kind of the three lenses of human-centered design, which can really help to anticipate this chasm and to try to overcome it. And in fact, it's relevant for that second chasm as well, because if you want to really understand why you might get stuck, unable to get to the majority, I think some of the same principles apply. So the three lenses of human-centered design, I apologize for those who know this well. This is a concept that's been around for a while. It's been popularized by companies like IDEO. The basic idea is that you've got three lenses that you can use to kind of view your product solution space. And this top lens here, market desirability, for us comes down to what's the clinical need? You know, what is the surgeon or a healthcare group intending to do? What do they need to achieve? There could be an operational need. It might be, how can I do more procedures in a day? How can I do them with fewer people? There may be a brand need. So you may say a hospital might need to attract more patients, or a surgeon may need to want to attract more patients, and so they may have that desire. There may be a particular user experience need that they have. And what's important to kind of consider here is that when we try to answer these questions is that you need to understand, well, what market segment are you looking at? If you just ask that question within an academic setting, you may get a very different answer than if you go and ask, what do you need in a rural area in India, for example? And so that kind of creates this challenge in understanding what is the market desirability and are you targeting the right market. You can achieve, or at least dig into this with methods like voice of customer research, human factor studies like we heard earlier on, clinical trials ultimately, and we'll get to how you get back to that. The second lens is technical feasibility. So if I have an idea of what some of the needs are, we need to figure out if it's technically feasible. So can I build something that has the capability to do to address the issue? Will it have performance? Will it be durable? Will it fit into an existing workflow, or do I need to change the workflow to make it fit? And will it be safe? Your third lens is commercial viability. So can I sell this? And can someone afford to buy it? And that comes down to how much does it cost to build your product? How much are you going to sell it for? How much is it going to be? How much is it going to cost to, each time someone uses it? So the cost per procedure in our case. How much would that cost offset for them? And I'll show you some examples. And what's the reimbursement climate? So you get sort of a sense of these three lenses. And so the question is, where do you start? Most people say, well, you need to start with what's the need, and that's a logical place to begin. But sometimes in research, a market may not exist, or you may not have a very good sense of what the market really is. And so you might start with the technology, because the technology is interesting. Or maybe you have a visionary that's telling you that there's going to be a future market need, and sort of you focus from that point of view, which can be more challenging. What we like to talk about, and many people have talked about this, is this idea of spiraling in to a product solution, which means it's a bit related to the comment earlier prior to lunch around this idea of solving puzzles versus solving problems. And so the approach here is to start with getting a basic sense of what the need is, and then quickly visiting these other lenses so that you're not fixating on a single lens. So moving from what is the basic need to figuring out what's the architecture of a solution from a technical perspective, and then being able to use the commercial viability lens as a sanity check to figure out, is this really feasible from a commercial perspective, and then iterating back into the market need where you can now dig in more deeply because you have a sense of what the solution space looks like. And so this is kind of a spiraling in example. Now, as I mentioned before, you might start with a technology, which is perhaps not ideal, but maybe that's where you begin. Maybe the technology is spun out of a different product development effort. Maybe it's come out of academia. But so you very quickly have to get to that market desirability question and anchor yourself there so you can spiral in. Of course, it's pretty obvious that if you, as was mentioned earlier, if you try to solve puzzles in each of in each of these lenses individually, you run a huge risk of not converging on that on that product solution space. And so that's something you really want to avoid, and it happens easily. I've been involved in many projects where, as an engineer, you get so in love with the technology that you forget to visit those other two lenses early enough, and you found that you've moved in completely the wrong direction with the technology because you haven't done that. So that's the challenge that we have collaboratively, I think. And so as a academic industry collaboration, we often are able to focus on at least two of these lenses, the technical feasibility piece and the market desirability piece. The commercial viability lens can be challenging because sometimes that's not really well compatible with sort of the academic point of view, but I would say that it would be really helpful if we can find ways to, as a series of collaborators, to work on this piece too. Otherwise, we run the risk of moving in a direction away from commercial viability, which ultimately won't lead us to product solutions. So I'm going to actually I'm going to digress a little bit and talk about commercial viability using this very interesting study. This is Bijlani et al. Published this year. There are many studies that relate to this question of commercial viability of Da Vinci, and there's quite a debate still in the community as to whether Da Vinci is commercially viable. What this group did that was quite interesting was to try to map out a fairly complex cost equation, specifically in this case for prostatectomy, but you can apply this in for many other procedures. So I'm going to try to step you through it. I would recommend reading the paper. It's quite accessible and interesting and thought-provoking. On the left side, you see basically this is where your patient enters the equation. You've got here their initial prostatectomy in this case, that's the surgery. You've got some subsequent treatments. You've got the aspect of the fact that they're not at work when this is happening, so absenteeism from work. And they've tried to model, for example, as part of the initial surgery, what are some of the potential outcomes? So procedure time, PACU time, length of stay time, intraoperative complications, in-hospital complications. And they've been able to come up with national data and publication data that quantify the values and probabilities of some of these outcomes. You've got recovery time that impacts absenteeism from work, and that's going to be accommodated later on in the model. And then you've got subsequent treatments, so you've got post-discharge complications, adjuvant therapies that can result in things like readmission, reoperation, and so on. So this middle bucket here, they've gone to incredible lengths to try to quantify the economics of these outcomes. And what's interesting, I'll skip a lot of the details, what's interesting is that at the end of this pathway, they've focused on the cost as viewed by three different perspectives. The first perspective is society, that's sort of the patient themselves and their productivity in society. The second perspective is the payer, so these are reimbursed costs, so typically insurance companies within the US. And the third stakeholder here is the hospital that's seeing non-reimbursed costs. So let's have a look. So they took two cohorts of patients through this model. One cohort that received a manual, an open retropubic radical prostatectomy. This is an open procedure. And another cohort that received a robot-assisted laparoscopic procedure. So first we look at the hospital. So this is kind of a stack-up of the costs as seen by the hospital. These would be the non-reimbursed costs. This is the chart of the open procedure, and this is the chart of the robotic procedure. So you can see that we've, for example, reduced length of stay quite significantly, but at the cost of increasing the cost of disposables and, of course, the amortization cost of the robot itself. So the net effect is that the hospital sees, this is now an average nationwide, sees an average of $341 more that they've had to pay for this procedure. So that was lens number one. If we switch over to the payer, this is now the robotic procedure, and we overlay the open procedure, and now you can see that with the increased costs of due to complications and other functional outcomes impacts, that the cost of to the payer, these are reimbursed costs, is increased in the open procedure by almost $1,500. Let's look through the third lens. This is the societal lens. This is basically wages and is tied to how long it takes this person to get back to productivity. This bar now is the robotic approach. This is the open approach, and here you can see that because of longer recovery time, we can account for roughly $1,200 in lost wages. So what's interesting about the study is that the summary of their findings in prostatectomy in particular in the US is that the hospital pays $350 more, the payer saves $1,450, and society gains $1,200. So a really complex picture, which kind of explains that if you look at the literature and see the wealth of studies around Da Vinci, is that they vary so much because it depends on which point of view that you're looking at, and it depends on your economic model of what you account for each of those folks through each of those lenses. So of course this depends on the particular procedure mix. If I did this for a hernia, for example, I might get a very different result than for prostatectomy. It depends on what market geography, if I look at a different country, what patient demographics, what site of care, is it an academic hospital or is it a community hospital, and what sort of system utilization are they achieving. I might get very different results. And so the commercial viability piece can be extremely challenging, and that's exactly why I think having that be part of the collaborative work that we do might be quite valuable. So I'm going to switch gears and actually give a couple of examples of projects that we've been involved in that relate to industry-university collaborations. This first one is a project that we did several years ago with Russ and the team. The basic idea here was that we had surgeons doing kidney and liver procedures that would rely on being able to use a laparoscopic ultrasound instrument. We did not have a laparoscopic ultrasound instrument that could be controlled from the robot, and so you'd have the situation where a surgeon would rely on an assistant to manipulate a scope, or they would scrub in and go and manipulate that scope themselves. And so the basic anticipated market need here was to have intraoperative ultrasound imaging that could work with Da Vinci, would give the surgeon the autonomy to control that instrument dexterously with an articulated wrist, and to have the visual feedback from that ultrasound be integrated with their display. So that was the basic idea. This was an NIH-funded STTR project between us, and so we set off and we tested technical feasibility by building a probe. This was, I think, actually a second-generation probe. We did several iterations. One of the big challenges here was building a wrist that could accommodate 128 coaxial fibers that ran from this ultrasound transducer to the back of the instrument and then out into the ultrasound scanner. So we had to build this thing to figure out if we could actually do that. We also implemented various user interface approaches, different ways of displaying the images to the surgeon in the console, a picture-in-picture versus this various overlaid approaches. This is Dr. Mike Choti here as our clinical PI, who was helping us to develop a user study based on this. This is, of course, Russ, who was getting his hands dirty as well and helping us in the lab. This is me wrangling a very large calf liver. And so this is all this is all focused on getting us to surgeon lab evaluation. So think of those three lenses. We started with a market need, we went to technical feasibility, and then we sort of short-circuited the commercial viability and went back to market desirability in order to test this device with surgeons in the lab. And so we got lots of great feedback. We learned that there are surgeons that are comfortable using ultrasound that would use this device. We learned of others that rely on a radiologist or a sonographer in the room that may be less likely to use the device. But generally, we had positive feedback around this idea of surgeon control of an ultrasound instrument. Then we went to commercial viability, and we had a look at what that would mean. So the cost of a typical laparoscopic ultrasound probe on the order of, at this time, was around $20,000. Our instruments, Da Vinci instruments, generally have a limited lifespan of around 10 uses. And so we thought, well, let's assume that we can push that to 20, which then meant a cost per use of $1,000, which was way above the budget that we'd been given in terms of what people would be willing to pay. Even a 50-use instrument, if we could get there, would have been about $400 a case, which is still double what a regular Da Vinci instrument costs. So we ran into this commercial viability challenge at this point. And there are lots of reasons, and there's lots of sort of technical backgrounds as to why we hit that. But essentially, we'd found clinical value, we'd found some operational value in terms of cleaning up the workflow, eliminating cables. We found some technical feasibility, but then we struggled with this commercialization barrier. But all was not lost. We learned from this project that there's value in the concept, but if we can separate the imaging tool from the instrument and not have them tied together in terms of their economics, then you have a viable thing. And so both Aloka and BK, who are big ultrasound, interoperative ultrasound manufacturers, were interested in developing these kinds of probes. This one here is the Aloka probe, this one is the BK probe, and they're both available on the market today. We had to give up some of the fancy graphical overlay stuff in that product, but it's still feasible and it still might come back in the future. We learned a lot about that. And interestingly enough, this sort of spin-off idea was that this large wrist in that earlier image that I showed, that large wrist architecture turned out to be useful as a precursor to a product that we have on the market today, which is a vessel sealing device. So we learned something that got recycled into multiple places. So I would call this a success, despite the fact that the original idea didn't quite come out the way that we expected. Another quick example. So the market need here is, how do we reduce positive margins in oncologic procedures? And so to underscore that, we're going to look at an example of breast cancer. So roughly 200,000 surgeries per year, quite a large positive margin rate here of 20 to 30%, and the impact of recurrence being quite expensive. So how do we go about solving this from a technical feasibility perspective? We connected with a group at Stanford that was working on the ability to image cancerous lesions using a fluorescent dye, and this is showing their prior work. This is a mouse model of colon cancer, and their fluorescent dye fluorescing here in these red highlights. We worked with their team to make their dye compatible with our existing infrared imaging system, which is already on the market, and we're able to demonstrate that again in a murine model. This is a mouse model with breast cancer in this case, with the green highlights indicating the lesions. This was a publication. This is my colleague Jonathan Sorger, so this was a collaboration that resulted in some publication as well. So then we switched to commercial viability. So if you look at the breast cancer example, assume that you have a 20% penetration rate into that 200,000 cases, so 40,000 patient doses per year. Assume $1,000 per dose would mean $40 million per year in revenue. So the big question here is, is that cost consistent with value that you would provide? So let's look at that. Cost of the procedure, around $12,000. Cost of a recurrence can be quite high. So there's a sense here that there may be a viable thing here. And let's look at how much it would cost to actually create this and develop this agent. This is now a pharmaceutical. So think about human trials, so getting through 3 phases of trials for a drug. That means 7 to 8 years, and probably at least $20 million to get yourself through that process. If you fail along the way and you reset, you repeat from the beginning. And so you start to get a sense of there's a desire in the market, but there's some challenges we still need to overcome, and it's going to take a while to figure out. So I'm running short on time, so I'm going to skip through some of this. Some additional lenses to consider when we think about working with academia. Actually, we need to include this aspect of education and publication. It was mentioned earlier in one of the earlier talks. In fact, industry can play a role in both of these areas. In terms of education, we can both participate and contribute, and also benefit from the educational piece of the academic component, or the academic partnership. These are all folks that work at Intuitive now that came out of Hopkins, some of them as interns, fellows, postdocs, one of them an industry postdoc, one a benefactor of hardware that we had donated to the university. And so here you can see a sharing of knowledge and education. From the publication standpoint, we can participate in publications in an interesting way. This is a project that we did with Greg. It's actually an ongoing project that is intending to leverage the ability to digitize surgery using DaVinci. So you imagine that because of that software in the loop aspect that I mentioned earlier, our ability to record motions and to digitize surgery is unique with a platform like DaVinci. So we've worked with Greg to harness some of that data. His group has been working with that data for years and has published in the last year, in 2015, a first data set that is now available to the community. And so this is a form of publication that hopefully spurs collaboration between multiple groups. I had a look at the website on the weekend, and there are now more than 24 publications from multiple groups for a variety of different interests based on this data set. This is another example. This is the DaVinci Research Kit, more on the hardware side, of a platform that we have donated to multiple universities, more than 24 sites worldwide, as a collaboration with Hopkins in this case. So we donated hardware. The Hopkins team have put out an open source software package, and all of these teams now share a common framework for collaboration and also a framework for translating some of their outputs to industry. And the upshot of this as well is that we've got a bunch of students that are coming out of their programs that know the DaVinci really well. So there's the educational aspect as well. So a very quick summary. We've talked about these three lenses. We've talked about the importance of viewing product development through each of these lenses and following somewhat of an iterative approach rather than getting stuck in this pattern puzzle solving problem. We've talked about the fact that there's value in collaboration. We each bring different expertise to this particular set of lenses. There's a challenge of us figuring out how we get around this curve more frequently or how we get through more cycles of this curve together rather than going through maybe one cycle and then throwing it over to industry or throwing it over to some other party. So I think that's the challenge ahead of us. I'll leave you with this slide in terms of opportunities for collaboration. If you ask that one question that I mentioned earlier, what does the market desire? What are some of the needs? These are very high level, but it'll give you a sense that there are incredible opportunities to continue to collaborate to solve some really challenging problems. So the first one here, how do we expand access to these kinds of technologies worldwide? I mean, we're just really scratching the surface of where we can provide value with these technologies. And we're going to need some real technology evolutions to touch parts of the world where DaVinci just isn't really a viable product. How do we reduce complications and provide patients with better outcomes? There's still a great deal of work to be done here. Our complication rates are nowhere near zero. How do we find new solutions for treating conditions that are not treatable today? And you'll hear a bit more about that this afternoon. How do we improve the user experience? How do we understand that? And then finally, this last bullet, 2 words, but represents a huge opportunity, which is how do we take this data digitization and gathering aspect of technologies like DaVinci and technologies in the OR, and how do we turn that into a decision support mechanism that can pool together the experience of many and provide it at the right time in the operating room. So I'll leave you with that, and be happy to take any questions. It's got to be one question. It's the stomachs competing for the brains. With the
I'm not a neurosurgeon, I'm a neurologist, but I'm interested, there must have been many other similar devices. Could you say why they failed and DaVinci became so dominant in the market?
That's a good question. Actually, there haven't been that many other devices. There was one other company that called Computer Motion that competed with Intuitive in the early days. I wasn't around at that time, so I wasn't as involved in that. I know that there was certainly an IP aspect of competitiveness between the two platforms, but they solved the problem of minimally invasive surgery and telepresence in different ways. And ultimately, I think it was a matching in terms of the market need, in terms of in terms of addressing a human factors and ergonomics issue in different ways that ultimately decided which platform was adopted. But I think that there's a longer answer to that question, but there haven't been as many, very many examples of companies in this space, although in recent times we've seen a renewed interest in the area, and we're going to see a lot more emerging technologies in this area.
You mentioned that one of the market needs is to reduce complications, and I'm curious to know if you can elaborate a little bit on what those complications might be.
Well, there are many. If you look at that study that I mentioned, they do quite a good job of breaking out what some of those complications are. And I think you can bucket them in many ways. There are certain complications that you really can't address that are intrinsic to the patient as they come through the door. But there are others that relate to, for example, the example that I gave, which is positive margins. So, for example, being able to visualize a tumor margin in order to remove it without leaving a positive margin would be a complication that you could solve potentially by providing the surgeon with better visibility or visualization of where cancer is versus healthy tissue. So, I mean, that's one of the big ones, is being able to see cancer so that you can avoid the complication of leaving cancerous cells behind. There are many others. There's a long list of complications to avoid. Things like severing a ureter during a procedure where you're not intending to injure a ureter is one that can be extremely costly throughout a patient's lifespan. So yeah, many complications, and there are lots of studies that outline exactly what the impacts of those complications are. A vague answer, but it's a big topic.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you.